Welcome to the Australian Property Investment Podcast with your host, Aaron Christie David. Each episode, we ask an expert to share their key insights for aspiring investors to make confident property choices.
G'day everyone, my name is Aaron Christie David. I'm your host of the Australian Property Investment Podcast. I'm also a mortgage broker and run a business called Atelier Wealth, where we specialise in helping property investors start out and scale up their property portfolios. And as they go on the journey, there are what I call blind spots that tend to come up, for example. So things that they didn't think they'd encounter, or maybe they hadn't got to that stage yet. Now they're realizing, okay, that's going to become some headwinds or something I should have known about or could have known about. And where that really becomes imperative is in having people that are maybe 2 or 3 steps ahead of them. And these are the professionals that are masters in their own space and what I call best in breed. And today's guest certainly meets that criteria as best in breed as a superstar accountant, but also all-round top bloke as well. It's another Ben Walker from Inspire Accountants. G'day, Ben. How you doing?
Yeah, good. Thanks, Aaron. Thanks for inviting me on the show.
No, mate, thanks for being here. And you're here in your own right because you're extremely knowledgeable. I mean, we've known of each other for quite some time, right? I admired your team and your work from afar. So for us to be able to connect and have a chat, particularly about what we're going to go through, which is self-managed super funds, it's something that's just going to roll off your tongue because this is your second language, which is all things like accounting and SMSFs, isn't it, Ben?
Yeah, absolutely. In fact, I think maybe it was my first language because I love it that much. So, we've been. I've actually been a SMSF member since I think 2010 or so. Wow. I've got to see so many different experiences with clients where they sort of invest in property, whether it's resi, commercial, development, all sorts of stuff through SMSF. So, yeah, I absolutely love it.
Wonderful, mate. We're going to go through all of that, what you mentioned. But before we do jump into it, it's what I like to call the 3 Ps. So it's a bit about yourself personally, a bit about yourself from a property perspective, what I'd be happy to share, and also from a professional's perspective a bit about your business as well, if you may indulge us, Ben.
Yeah, awesome. Well, a bit about myself personally. On the weekends, I absolutely love smoking on the barbecue. So probably about 18 months ago, I got into it when all those lockdowns happened, and just looking for stuff to do on the weekend, and chucking some beef ribs or I'm just into beef shanks at the moment, or beef shins, some of them are called.
Nice.
They just come up beautifully. So that's the personal.
Is your YouTube feed just full of like slow, because that's what happens, right? You watch one recipe and next thing you know, you're getting fed like all these low and slow American style videos and
absolutely
experience. Yeah. It's a rabbit hole, isn't it?
That's it. The algorithm is good. It feeds me what I want.
Nice.
And then from a property perspective, is that the next P?
Yeah.
Yeah. So, our family sort of invested in mostly residential property over the years. And, we've kind of bought and sold, especially in this, the market that we've seen, held on to some properties, which, one of them was actually our own home that we built, and we went to sell it, which was worth less than what we paid to build it. That was kind of towards the tail end of 2019, and I was stoked with what happened to the market, and it picked up, and we even made a small profit on it. So almost like a bit of a mistake where we sort of built the wrong product. It was a lovely house, but it was in the wrong place for that level of spec.
Did you mean you kind of almost out-renovated or outbuilt yourself for the market? Is that kind of what your realization was?
Yeah, that's right. So the thing I learned there is making sure you get your whatever you if you build the appropriate thing for that market, and we probably spent sort of 30-40 grand too much on the thick benches and the ducted aircon and the really thick carpets, like that sort of stuff. So
I mean, we've made the exact same mistake. We had Bernie and I did an apartment. It was beautiful, the subway tiles and like all sleek appliances, and it was a unit in the burbs, and it was a square peg in a round hole, perhaps, and people didn't see the value in kind of what we renoed on it, perhaps, as well, isn't it?
Yeah, absolutely.
Third P is professional. So a bit about yourself and Inspire, yeah.
Yeah, so I started Inspire in 2013 and started out of a bit of a passion or sort of saw where the accounting industry was going, and I didn't like that. I didn't like where it's heading with all the hourly rates and crappy technology, and thank goodness for trends that happen where a lot of accounting firms now aren't charging by the hour; they give fixed pricing up front.
Yes.
They use cloud technology and use that to absolutely engage or help the relationship with the client rather than let it get in the way. So, I sort of started it with what I reckon the client's needs were, and we haven't always got it perfect, but I think we're in a pretty good place and love working with the clients that we work with.
Excellent, mate. I call accountants the rock stars of COVID because everyone loved to call their accountant during COVID. Right? They couldn't hear from them enough.
Yeah, absolutely. We did get quite a few phone calls.
Yeah. And rightly so. I mean, the accountant played a pivotal role in a lot of small business owners and medium business owners navigating what they could and couldn't do during COVID and taking that tricky time. And I guess where a lot of businesses have now, their realization is, hang on, buying property through whether it's self-employed or now they're trying to buy a commercial space, for example, or even mum and dad investors, as you call them, or solo investors, looking at another avenue to invest in, which is a self-managed super fund. So for maybe those are the uninitiated into SMSF, then you do want to kind of throw back to when you started and go, okay, what is a self-managed super fund and a purchase involved through this type of vehicle as well, Ben?
Yeah, great. So a self-managed super fund is like an alternative to your sort of industry super funds or your bank-owned big super funds that you might get when you first signed up for a job. And you have to have one. You have to have an account that your employer pays money into. And most of us don't give it much thought at the start. But what we see that because we work with small business clients, a lot of them want to use their wealth in super to actually help sort of speed up the growth in their family, and sometimes even it can assist with what they do with the business from a commercial space. And so, some of them opt to take that control back, and it's called self-managed for a reason. It takes a lot of self-managing. Doesn't happen by its own, but it does give you options. And it's I think it's the only way with superannuation to actually invest in direct property. So actually own the bricks and mortar, so to speak, yourself. And the good bit about it is you don't have to have all of the bit of a misconception is you have to have the value of the property saved up in cash. And through the help of people like Aaron, you can actually access bank money along with a deposit from your self-managed super to buy a property. The other cool thing is you can pool your super balance with your spouse. And currently it was four members in a super fund, but now it's actually up to 6. Bit of a warning though on going too many. But you can actually pool your super balances with multiple family members, keeping in mind that acts as your deposit to buy a property.
It's one of the big questions that do come up, Ben, and this is a little bit subjective, and I do want to preface our comments by saying this is not financial advice, this is general in nature, but one of the questions that does come up is, well, how much should I have in a balance? And so this is almost a 3-way conversation that comes up between someone like yourself, myself, and probably a financial planner at this stage as well, to make sure that we're all aligned from the strategy for a client. But from your own experience, where do you see that sweet spot as a minimum balance, given that the cost to set up and the time to set up then just becomes another barrier as well, doesn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. So, I mean, if you Googled that question, how much do you need to start SMSF? There'll be tons of articles that suggest anywhere between sort of 200 and 250 grand. Now, what they usually look towards there is actually the break even on the fees of the fund, because normally those industry funds are on a percentage basis. So they'll charge you, 0.8 or 1.3 or some sort of small percentage of your superannuation balance to manage that each year, versus a self-managed super fund where if you're looking after it yourself and you're not sort of delegating it to an advisor to run a portfolio and manage that, which is sometimes isn't a percentage-based fee, but if you're running it yourself, then it's normally fixed costs to run that fund. And the costs you can expect are the accounting fees for the compliance and the administration, and then an annual audit, which is usually a few $100s, and there's not too much more than that. So if you've got a balance of $1 million and you're paying a 1% fee, that's $10,000 in fees to have your super managed, versus the fixed fees of maybe $3,000 or $4,000 a year for an accountant who knows their stuff around SMSFs to manage that for you, including sort of that third party fee for the auditor. So that's what they usually compare it on, and that's where you get the numbers of 200 to 250K.
Yeah.
My perspective is it absolutely depends on what you want to invest it in. So if you want to invest it in a property, you might only need 100 grand, which is a very small amount to have in super, but you need to actually work backwards from, hey, what do you want to self-manage it into? And if that answer is property, then it you need to work out what your deposit needs to be. And if you do have enough to make that work, then it's a question of, hey, do you want to take that risk and try to open an SMSF and try to make a better return than you would leaving it where it is?
You mentioned very early on when people look to buy, whether it's buying residential, commercial, for example, they're self-employed. So take us through some of, I guess, those common scenarios that you will see when you're working with your own clients, Ben, when, if it's, okay, looking to buy purely an investment property, I want to buy it through my self-managed super fund versus maybe some other situations that you see as well.
Yeah, yep. I mean, in terms of our client base, the majority of our people who invest through or to have an SMSF actually choose to invest in commercial property. And without actually looking at the numbers, it might be 70% of SMSF properties are actually commercial, 30% are resi. And we kind of see that because when you own commercial property in your own SMSF, you can rent that to your business, your own business, which is owned outside of super. So almost owner occupying, if I can put it like that, where your business is owner occupying. Versus with residential property in super, you can't have any personal use, or any relative of yours cannot have any personal use of that property. So you can't buy the house next door and move your parents in, almost like in a bit of a granny flat sort of setup.
Or you can't buy the holiday house down the coast and then rent it back, or any family can rent it either as well, isn't it?
Absolutely, yeah. That's the no-no, and that's the rule there is called the sole purpose test. It has to be set up for the SMSF funds have to be used for the sole purpose of retirement or the benefit of your dependents on death. So if you're getting access to a holiday home, that's not necessarily taking it out through retirement, if that makes sense. So,
absolutely. I mean, working with a lot of self-employed clients, I mean, that's one of the sweet spots for your business. And speaking from our experience, rent becomes one of those constants, right, in your business. It's one of those almost cash flow killers at some point, that when rents go up, it lifts the cost of the business. Whereas an advantage by owning the property and you're paying that rent to yourself, you then rent control, I guess, your expenses for one, but the McDonald's model is they own the property and they happen to sell burgers on that property. So the idea is you actually control a little bit of your own destiny by owning the real estate that you operate from as well, isn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. And that becomes important when we've got sort of big manufacturing clients or e-commerce clients where they've got a warehouse sort of set up, and the cost to move might be hundreds of thousands of dollars to move all their equipment and stock out to another location. And so, I think that is the destiny sort of thing where they want to lock in. They don't want to be sort of subject to a lease expiring and then not being able to renew. And that could wipe literally a couple $100,000 off the value of their business or their net worth. So we see that a lot, and also just making better use of money. You mentioned the rent piece and having better control of that. There actually is limitations on being able to charge, I guess, what you want when it comes to paying your own SMSF rent. The rules say that it has to be market rate, so you can't overpay, but you also can't underpay as well. So you do have to get market value substantiation for what you're charging, but to a degree, you are your own landlord. So if you want to paint the walls, a weird color, go for it. If you want to do a renovation or add a mezzanine floor to a warehouse, you don't have to apply to your landlord, get permission, all that sort of stuff. You can just kind of take the action there.
Yeah.
Plus, you can also be savvy about how you spend money on fit outs and renovations in super. For instance, one of the big benefits for owning in super is you've got a lower tax environment in super than you do outside. So you may want to spend money around, equipment and like furnishings and fittings outside of super in the business, where your tax deduction goes a lot further. But things like capital works, like building that mezzanine floor, you can't deduct immediately outside super. So because you don't get that big benefit, then you may prefer to cash flow that from inside super. So you kind of get the choice of who pays what. Yeah, that's kind of the beauty of it.
Yeah. And when you say that's the beauty of it, I mean, you've just given us a whole stack of reasons as to why it's not only a great avenue, but also planning becomes super important. That if you are looking to, say, do the mezzanine level, having the foresight to have a chat to your account rather than just going ahead and funding and realize that you've mismanaged funds, for example, you made a bit of a mistake there, the way you've gone about funding it. it just pays to kind of have those prep calls with an accountant or a planner to go, here's what I'm looking to do and what are the implications of doing that as well.
Yeah, absolutely.
Perfect. I guess the pros and cons, again, you talked about Googling articles, and when you Google articles about SMSFs, you get rafts and rafts of articles, and almost sometimes contradicts one another sometimes. But one of the big questions when we're talking to our clients about SMSF investment versus out of, it's the pros and cons.
Yeah.
Have you got a bit of a hit list that says, here's the advantages? You mentioned tax effectiveness is one, but the reasons too, and then possibly the reasons when it isn't relevant for someone to go down this pathway as well?
Well, I guess inside versus outside, the first sort of thing is the lending sphere or that sort of stuff, which I think you could probably comment on a lot more than me. But what I've noticed is outside of super, the options, you get much more options with commercial property. But inside super, there's still lenders who do that. You just have a lot less. And it's under this thing called a limited recourse borrowing arrangement. So your SMSF can't loan money directly. We have to set up this vehicle, which is that LRBA, that's the acronym, that can actually go and lend that money. So there is some complexity around that. But I guess at the end of the day, Aaron, you've probably seen the application form for an SMSF loan. It's like 3 or 4 pages long versus outside of super. It's like,
if you're lucky, it's 3 or 4 pages. Yeah, it's
40. But it's huge. So, I say it's less complex outside super, but at the end of the day, that's just the mechanism. I actually think it's simpler to find finance in super if you've got the right conditions. Now, the next thing, or the next big advantage of super, and I hinted on it before, is the tax outcome. So in super, let's say you could buy a commercial property in or out of super. If you bought it in super, you're going to pay tax on that if you're in accumulation mode. As in building your super balance over your lifetime at 15% tax. So your rent expense comes out of your business. You get a deduction probably around the 30-something% mark, and then you pay tax on it in the super fund at 15% tax. You've basically halved your tax rate on that rent, which is a pretty good outcome. Or if you're in pension mode, say you've owned that commercial property for a while, you've retired, you've reached the conditions of turning your super into a 0% pension fund, which is basically 0% tax on earnings.
Yeah.
You pay $100,000 of rent into your super fund, you get your 30-something% tax deduction outside of super, and you pay no tax on that when it goes in. Also keep in mind that within the right conditions and limits and all of that, you can actually go and sell your commercial property in pension mode, and there are conditions where you pay 0% tax on that gain. And if you've held your property for 10, 20, 30 years, that tax difference would be huge compared to outside of super.
I mean, that is one of the significant decisions, isn't it? When you go to, I guess, sell the assets, for example, especially in that pension mode, it's if you've bought well, if you've planted the seed well, you're going to reap the rewards that well into your retirement, which is what super is all about. It's planning for your retirement. And that's where I guess, if you're playing the long game, particularly around property, it's one of those options that can give you dividends well into your twilight years, isn't it?
Yep, absolutely. And then I guess some other sort of perspectives on it. There used to be a bit of a difference in what the banks would lend outside versus inside super. I sort of saw with clients that only go to maybe 50, 60, 70% was high in super, but now that seems to have sort of risen a bit. Where
we're doing consistently like 80% lends on SMSF as well. And I guess partly people go, oh, hang on, the rates are higher and the fees are higher, but the upside, you're almost paying to play, isn't it? To then have the long-term upside, if that's the strategy for the buy and the hold, and then it's either the cash flow or the capital gain, that is the upside that you're playing in the game for, isn't it?
Yeah, and I'd really recommend when people are considering that, and then that's one of the things that pops up, hey, it's a higher rate. Have a think about how quickly you could pay that loan down. So as an SMSF, if you own the property, you're receiving rental income. And if you're also contributing to super, you might be receiving $27,500 per person or per member of that fund if you're maxing out your annual contributions. So let's say you've got husband and wife plus rent. That might be easily 100, 150K, depending on obviously rent and values and that sort of stuff. But a lot of money coming in to pay down that loan. So we've got a lot of things paying that money off, for instance. and again, from the tax benefits of it all, you may actually be way better off than just purely looking at the interest rate, because they are usually a lot higher than
yeah. I guess where you and I have seen the benefits of when people have done very well. We just kind of touched on when it's done well, what are the upsides to buying? But then there's also the flip side to that, is some of the mistakes that you've seen people make. And sometimes they can be expensive mistakes. Sometimes it's innocent mistakes. Sometimes it's unintended perhaps, but sometimes there's still a mess to clean up. Also, there is an issue there as well. Can you take us through some of those maybe common issues that you've seen in the past where you go, hey, look, we could have avoided this, or maybe it was bad advice they were given, or maybe it was just innocence perhaps as well, Ben?
Yeah, I've got to say we don't get too many messes, and maybe that's because we're on the front foot from an advice perspective, and we sort of work with our clients and give that expectation to say, hey, look, if you've got any doubt about anything going in or out of your SMSF banking, give us a call.
Beautiful.
But I have seen some pretty hectic stuff in the past. I had a client at a previous firm who'd basically sold a business, put a heap of it into super, and was living on that, like literally just taking the money out of his SMSF, and for about 10 years didn't lodge a tax return, tried to sort of get away with it, so to speak, and ended up having to pay that all back to his SMSF, which I guess that's not really a property thing. But other things is so I guess we don't want to muck around with the super rules. We want to know them, understand them, and work within them. I guess things where it goes wrong, and a common question is, hey, can I just load up the rent bill because I want to get more money into super because of the tax deduction and that sort of thing? Mm-hmm. A lot of it is no. The moment we go and do that, we start playing with either the sole purpose test, or we're looking at tax avoidance. So both of those things aren't fantastic for us as accountants or the client.
Yeah.
And that might be an actually innocent question. They just don't know. So there's that. And then also, buying the wrong property. What you're going to do there is, if you buy a property, the value drops and then you end up selling it, you've cut your superannuation balance down a fair chunk. But I think that I'm not seeing a lot of that lately for probably pretty obvious reason. But that principle applies not just in super but outside as well. Yeah, if you buy wrong, you're stuffed regardless of the structure.
Yeah.
And maybe just one more thing.
Go for it.
Sort of unexpected in the process. A lot of people think it's quite quick to set up an SMSF, and sometimes it can be done within a few weeks. But that relies on the outgoing superfund being quick to respond and all that sort of stuff. Plus the costs as well. So depending on the lender and what they require for your property, they might need you to go and see and get signed off by a lawyer. It might be a pain in the ass. It might be a quick, a couple of page form that they need you to do, but they're not going to do that until you sit in front of a lawyer, and the lawyer is going to tell you the risk of this. Similarly, we've seen it with financial planning as well. So some lenders will want you to go and get that signed off on, and that can be a couple of grand with those two conversations, depending on how much that person needs to be comfortable to sign off. Yeah. So that can be unexpected. Plus, I think valuations and things you need to usually pay up front on commercial. That LRBA structure I spoke about before, we charge a few grand to set that separate entity up. So you've got your SMSF, which is usually a couple of grand to get going, and then you've got your LRBA vehicle, which actually the language on it is the Bear Trust that we need to set up. Like, that's a couple of grand as well. So, I mean, you do have to dip into your pocket a little bit just in terms of these fees that you may face as you go through the setup process. So,
I'm really glad you said that, because that's typically from our experience where people get excited, like, they've heard about it, or one of their friends in their network has said they bought through an SMSF and it plants the seed. And I love that it gets the juices going, and it's the momentum, and it's like we lose a little bit of that steam when they realize the cost and especially the time frame that's involved. Whereas when they go, hey, look, I just want to buy an investment property, residential investment property in my own name, that's super, super quick and super, super easy, and very little in the way of costs that are involved, versus the flip side, which is going down the SMSF pathway. But it can be very rewarding. And that's what we're saying to people. It almost filters people out that just go, hey, look, that sounds too hard, and they don't venture down that path. But for the people that can persist, the upside and the rewards can be there if you're willing to push through those extra costs. And like any investment, there's going to be some reward, but there's also and risk. and there's going to be some costs that are involved. So engaging a professional, we say there's no such thing as a cheap lawyer or a cheap planner. You don't want a cheap lawyer or a cheap planner when it comes to your financial future as well, isn't it? And an accountant in that respect as well.
Yeah. Yep. No, that's it. And we've just on that point as well, like we've had clients where we sort of prospective clients where we talk through our process for our SMSFs and all that sort of stuff. And then we get to the price and we go, oh, $3,000. Huh. If you jump on Dr. Google and type in set up SMSF cheap, and you might get it for a few $100, but it's all the other stuff we do throughout that process that the computer is not going to do for you. It's the sounding board and all that sort of stuff. And if you stuff it up, if there's non-compliance in that fund, you hugely risk your ability to keep running that fund.
Totally. So, and when it comes to property, self-managed means you asset selection is completely your choice, right? So whether you choose to invest in shares, whether you leave it in cash, whether you go in property, you get to self-manage how and where and when, what you invest in, right? So when you're investing in property, and we want to talk specifically about property, then it's a choice of should you buy new versus buy established. And again, these have their own kind of pros and cons as well, because then it's about, well, renovations or capital works on the property. You can't borrow, but then it's also buying new kind of has a lot of people then say, hey, look, that's less risky than buying something established. So have you kind of come across those conversations with people when it comes to asset selection via the SMSF as well?
Yeah, we're not too involved in the decision on sort of what asset to purchase, apart from sort of general feedback, and I kind of will run through a bit of that. But the new versus existing, there's differences in depreciation that came in, I think, in 2017. Yeah, you get a lot more depreciation in new property than you do in existing, and that can be $5,000-$10,000 a year, depending on all sorts of things, but it can be massive when it comes to the tax benefits of buying new. But you usually generally do have a greater market if you buy existing. So there's upsides, downsides. You've got the whole repairs on a secondhand place usually higher than brand new. So and then also when it comes to SMSF lending, you can't actually borrow money to renovate or improve an asset in super. So let's say you bought a shell of a warehouse and you wanted to put a mezzanine floor in. You've got to fund that. If you buy it in SMSF, you've got to fund that with 100% cash from your SMSF. You can't do that by borrowing a loan for improvements like you may be able to do outside of super. So that can really limit your ability. And there's workarounds for that. Like, for instance, the tenant, or even if it's yourself, you can prepay a fair bit of rent to I guess, start those renovations or do those improvements. We had a client there, they chipped in a 12-month prepayment of rent, and then they were able to go and do it was actually a mezzanine level. But I guess there's things you can do from that perspective, but you can't just borrow money for that. Other things that have gone wrong, not our clients, but you kind of hear these in technical updates. You can't borrow for two assets. You can't have one loan for two assets. And they've changed things a lot with contracts, especially in Queensland. But sometimes if you're buying an apartment, you had a contract for the apartment and a contract for the car park. They were two separate contracts, and that's actually a breach of the rules. So what they did is with your apartment, you get one contract, and then you get the exclusive use of that car park written into that contract. So you got to be careful there. But again, if you're buying something, so I've seen some commercial properties where there's two lots, therefore two contracts. You've actually got to have two separate loans for that purchase. So, just keeping that in mind. That's not very common to have that problem, but it can pop up as you go. That's
super helpful. Super helpful. Thanks very much. And I guess from your perspective, pure as put your accounting hat on and go, what are some of the, I guess you call them do's and don'ts when you're talking to maybe new clients or people that are listening? Maybe it's what catches out some investors, or maybe it's some issues around non-compliance, for example. So when you're talking to people, the do's and don'ts, what would be your insights there, Ben?
Yeah, I think if you're going to explore property in super, do as much of the preparation as you can before you go hunting. Good brokers who know this space well will be able to do almost not necessarily like a pre-approval, but they'll be able to do their homework and work with the lenders to see whether they'll go ahead. Can you get full-on pre-approval, Aaron? Or?
Yes, I mean, you get a pre-approval to the point that even if it's not set up, it's like we will be pre-approved or conditionally approved on the basis of setting it up this way, and then nothing else has changed in your scenario. So yeah, banks, I feel like lenders are very much open to that. People think, oh, nothing's set up yet, therefore I can't go ahead. But it's almost like, hey, look, the banks that are great in this space almost want to work with you or a client to say, yeah, if you're going to set it up, and we'll pre-approve it on this basis as well, which then gives everyone that vote of confidence before they go down the path of the accountant's time and the cost to set it up. It's like, yes, the bank will lend. Now let's go ahead and pull this together as well.
Yep. And that'll give you some guidance as well of how much the bank will lend, which gives you guidance on what sort of property you can get. Also keep in mind, and again, this is a conversation with the broker, if you chipped in some more contributions in that financial year, will that allow you to buy a more expensive property? So, because they do look at the contributions that you make each year plus the expected rental return on the property to work out how much they'll lend. So, you may be able to chip in more contributions. So that's also something to keep in mind. If you haven't made any contributions, because self-employed, there's situations where you don't need to, but if you haven't done that, you may want to start planning for that. If you want to buy property in super, start considering making those contributions this year, maybe next financial year, that sort of thing. Again, not financial advice, of course, but these are commercial realities.
Absolutely. Yeah, and this is it. If you have a conversation that goes, hey, look, these are eyes wide open going into it, and maybe I'll share some insights. But again, it's your situation may be very specific to yourself, depending if you're self-employed. If you're PAYG, for example, if you're buying commercial, if you're buying residential, if you're buying brand new, if you're buying established, it has these little quirks to it, but the core principles are still the same. And it doesn't matter if you're investing inside super or out. It's what are you doing and why are you doing it should really be the forefront of those questions that you're asking, and knocking on the door for the right partners, such as your accountant, financial planner, or broker, to then go, let's get on the same page with the game plan here and just make sure that we're not missing any blind spots as well.
Yep, no, absolutely. Some of the don'ts. I mentioned the bloke who lived on his super. Don't do that. That's a bit silly. But I guess do work with your accountant to avoid making mistakes of spending money where it shouldn't be, for instance, with super. And that goes when you're looking to get the property, but also afterwards as well. So when your business is renting from your super fund, and you've got, you make sure you got a lease in place, and if you want to spend money on something, work with your advisor to work out what the best way for that to happen is. But yeah, make sure you're paying market rate rent if you're owner occupying it. Get substantiation for that as well. So get an appraisal, not just I bought it for $1 million. The yield should be around 7%. I'm going to charge myself $70,000 a year. That's not quite enough, so to speak. You want to get like that third party real estate agent appraisal. And that's actually for your own paperwork and the audit of the fund and that sort of thing. So and other non-compliance, we've covered a bit of it through the conversation. So you can't own or occupy resi. Your family or relatives can't do that.
I mean, you've been doing this. I mean, you talked about, I think you said, 2010 you started, and that was very, very early on. I remember when I started in broking a few years back, and SMSFs were very much still a new product. In fact, not very many banks were doing it. Banks have then come and gone, for example. Often they say that it's too expensive for them to manage this as a product, which is why a lot of the banks stepped out. Some do it purely as a commercial loan. Some banks let brokers write it. It's got to go through their commercial division. Some banks, let the brokers free rein. So it feels like even it's in its infancy. It's coming, I guess, maybe out of it being a new product or a new phenomenon. Now it's becoming a little bit more mainstream. But there's still a fair bit of unknowns to it as well, isn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. And again, you get the right advisors around you that have done this before, and they'll be able to walk you through it. And we've had clients without any idea of SMSFs, and again, it's just that education process. We take them through. Again, good broker, good people around them is what makes the magic happen.
Perfect, mate. It's exactly that. Teamwork's probably what's the saying? If you want to go fast, go alone. If you want to go far, go together. And I feel like this is one of those one of those parts of investing in property that if you want to go far, it pays dividends just to get the right team around you and supporting you, that you're not going to make an expensive mistake or a fatal flaw perhaps as well.
Absolutely.
Hey, Ben, mate, thank you so much for your time. Like I said, this rolls off your tongue because not only do this daily, but you live and breathe this, right? And this is why it pays to really go to a professional. So have a chat to your accountant or your planner or your broker if buying and borrowing through your self-managed super fund is something you're keen on. And on behalf of myself and our team here, Ben, just want to say thank you very much for your time and thanks for your focus, mate. Really appreciate it.
Appreciate that, mate. Thank you.
Excellent. If you found this episode helpful, you actually want to get in touch with Ben from Inspire, we'll include his details in the bio below and a link to Inspire Accountants as well, so you can check them out. And I really enjoyed having a chat to Ben and picking his brain on all things SMSF. Until next time, this has been another episode of the Australian Property Investment Podcast. I'm Aaron Christy David, and I'll talk to you soon. Thanks.